Mr. Brown, is it true that you secretly transferred more than $200,000 into secret accounts while your wives couldn't pay their bills? The judge's inquiry cut through the courtroom like a knife. And for the first time, Kody Brown, the man who had an empire built on faith, family, and domination, was speechless. Cameras blazed, mouths agape, and two angry women stood up. Janelle and Meri were no longer ex-wives. They were plaintiffs, and this was no family feud. This was a war for justice that would expose lies hidden for decades and topple Kody's meticulously constructed kingdom from the ground up. Mr. Brown, did you transfer more than $200,000 into hidden accounts without informing your wives? The judge's voice cut across the crowded courtroom like a sharp knife, quieting the speculations that had hung on people's lips just seconds before. The threat of that one question loomed heavily, dangling in mid-air like a hangman's noose. Cameras popped in the viewing gallery, journalists frantically scribbled, and in the back of the room a producer for a streaming channel leaned over and said, "This is going to break records." Kody Brown, the smooth-talking matriarch of a large plural family that had been followed by millions on TV, now appeared before the world, not as husband, not as father, but as man charged with betrayal so profound it could undo all he had created. The courtroom tension was palpable. Janelle and Meri, sitting at the plaintiff's table, shared a look, a silent recognition of the long journey that brought them here. They had lived for years under the illusion of togetherness. They had taken Kody's words of equality, partnership, and shared aspirations at face value. But at the foundation of their so-called family empire was an intricate weave of lies, constructed with stealth precision. Today, that illusion was being ripped apart, strand by strand, under the unforgiving light of the law. Kody shifted uncomfortably in his seat, adjusting his tie as if the simple act could steady his nerves. Gone was the confident swagger that once defined him, the same confidence that had charmed four women into sharing their lives with him. His face, usually composed and calculating, betrayed flickers of fear. He knew the stakes. This wasn't some childish family feud. This was fraud, betrayal, and the erosion of trust, and it was all taking place on television. "Your Honor," Janelle's lawyer started, standing carefully, voice calm but dripping with venom. "For more than a decade, my clients thought they were partners in life and money. They constructed enterprises, had children, and put every dollar they made into what they were led to believe was a collective family pool. But what they did not know, could ever have dreamed, was that Mr. Brown and his fourth wife, Robyn, were secretly transferring those monies into hidden accounts. Funds meant for the future of the family were being used to construct their own private dynasty." The words struck Kody like a hammer. He stared at the floor, refusing to meet the eyes of the women he had once promised to protect. Meri's hands tightened into fists on the table, her knuckles white. For years, she had doubted herself. She had accepted Kody's brush-off excuses, his assertions of strategic financial decisions and family investments. But now the truth was finally being voiced, and with each utterance, the pain of betrayal seared more intensely. Janelle, normally the level-headed and even-tempered one, could not keep rage in check. She rose, voice shaking but unyielding. "We trusted him," she asserted, her voice resounding through the hushed courtroom. "We constructed our lives around him. And he leveraged that trust to rob us." Gasps coursed through the crowd. Even those who had been tracking the family's soap opera on TV for years were shocked by the naked emotion in her voice. This was not reality TV anymore. This was real. Kody's lawyer, a well-tailored man with a practiced smirk, stood to object, but the judge held up a hand. "Overruled," she declared. "Mrs. Brown has a right to be heard." It was a small win, but for Janelle and Meri, it was enormous. For so long, their voices had been silenced, their concerns ignored in deference to Kody's story. Now, for the very first time, they were being heard. The prosecutor led off with the first bit of evidence, a string of bank statements detailing huge transfers of cash out of the family account into a shell company in Robyn's name. The figures were astronomical: $20,000 here, $50,000 there, all silently drained away over several years. It was all a betrayal, every signature a stab in the back. "Mr. Brown," the judge snapped, her voice honed. Did you sign off on these transfers? Kody swallowed hard. I don't know the details, he stammered, his typical self-assurance wavering. Let me assist in refreshing your memory, the prosecutor said icily, waving a paper in her hand. This here is your signature on the transfer authorization of March 14, 2022, isn't it? Kody hesitated. Yes, he conceded eventually. And this one? Yes, and this yes. With each yes, the ground beneath his defense gave way. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the once immunized patriarch confessed, slowly clawing his way through a litany of actions that had led him to this place. It was an agonizing, plodding unraveling. Public shame for a man who had constructed his life on control and domination. Meri leaned forward, her tone low but firm. You said there was no money, she told him. You said I couldn't fix up my inn because the family could not afford it. You said to Janelle that we could not pay the property taxes on Coyote Pass. And the entire time you were squirreling away money. Kody's mouth opened to answer, but the words were stuck in his throat. No excuse remaining to be made. No lie plausible enough to wash away the evidence piled up against him. For the first time ever he was at a loss. The judge scanned the courtroom, her gaze landing on Kody. This court has a serious concern about financial dishonesty, she declared firmly. Especially when that dishonesty includes the intentional hiding of assets from legal partners. She let the gravity of her words hang in the air. You may have thought you could control those around you, Mr. Brown, but the law will not be controlled. As the initial session ended, tension was palpable. Outside the courthouse, trucks from the news networks pulled up to the curb. Headlines were already being typed. Kody Brown charged with financial betrayal, sister wives patriarch sued for fraud, Brown empire founded on deception. Inside, Janelle and Meri shared another glance. Not a victorious one, but a determined one. This was just the start. For years Kody had dictated the script, bending the facts to conform to his definition of family and authority. But now the truth was larger than him. It was documented in bank statements, attested to by witnesses, and reverberated off the courtroom walls. And as the judge took his bench for the day, one thing was certain: the man who had dominated his family like a king was now no more than another defendant awaiting judgment. And this time, he would not be able to escape the truth. It was here, it was irrefutable, and it was going to tear apart all that he believed he could conceal. The gavel had come down, and with it, Kody Brown's meticulously constructed world was starting to unravel. This was not a tale of love, of family, or of religion. This was one of justice. And justice, as the world would soon see, was on its way with vengeance. The courtroom was hushed only by the soft whir of the ceiling fans and the regular beat of Janelle's heel on the marble floor. It wasn't nervousness, it was anger simmering just below the surface. She had held it in for years, telling herself that being loyal to the family meant keeping her mouth shut. But now, as the proof piled up, and the walls of Kody's meticulously built deceptions finally began to crack, the burden of that silence weighed more than ever. This was not just a trial. This was a reckoning decades in the making. And as she readied herself to testify, Janelle realized that everything she said today would redo the history of their lives. Mrs. Brown, the lawyer started softly as she put up her right hand and promised to tell the truth. Can you let the court know when you first realized there was financial irregularity? Her breathing caught a little. Not from fear, but from the rush of memories surging ahead. It was about 3 years ago, she replied slowly. I recall because it was the year we were attempting to raise money for Coyote Pass. There was a whisper that ran through the courtroom. Coyote Pass was to be the jewel of the Brown family's fantasy. Vast land in Flagstaff where they had planned to construct homes alongside each other, and at last live together like one great family. But that fantasy had become a money nightmare. Janelle went on, voice firm but shaking at the margins. We were in a squeeze. Kody explained that the family budget was stretched. He said the income from the show was not as good, that bills were mounting. I believed him. We all did. I even withdrew from my retirement to cover some of the property taxes. There was a gasp from the gallery. She stopped, her eyes shifting to Kody, who had not met her gaze. And yet, as I was depleted my savings, he was shipping thousands into accounts we had no idea about. The lawyer presented the jury with a set of bank statements on the screen. Wire transfers from the family account to newly established LLCs. Do these transfers coincide with the timeline you're describing? They do, Janelle answered. While I was paying on Coyote Pass so it wouldn't default, he and Robyn were spending money on furniture, investments in private businesses, even on deposits on properties that had nothing to do with the family. At the defense table, Robyn shifted restlessly, her perfectly manicured hands nodding in her lap. The cameras homed in on her face. The woman once depicted as the innocent, wronged wife, now a central figure in a tale of fraud and greed. Did Mr. Brown ever take advice from you or Mrs. Meri prior to making these transfers? The attorney continued to drill. Never, Janelle replied steadfastly. We discovered by accident, and even then he kept denying it until the evidence was in front of his eyes. Meri followed to testify. The courtroom leaned in as she walked with careful steps, each move burdened with the weight of years spent under deception. I believed him. She started softly. I trusted the man I married, the man who promised to protect all of us equally. But instead, he protected himself. And Robyn. Her voice cracked, and for a brief moment, the mask of calm slipped, revealing the pain beneath. I almost lost my inn because of those lies. He told me we didn't have the funds to help with renovations, that the family couldn't support it. I trusted him. And now I realize that when I was on my knees pleading with banks for loans, he was writing checks to himself. The prosecutor moved closer. Mrs. Brown, did you ever consent, explicitly or implicitly, to let Mr. Brown manage family money without telling you? No, Meri replied firmly. The agreement was always that major financial decisions would be discussed with all of us. We're a family, or at least, that's what he said. But that was a lie too. A silence descended upon the room. The betrayal was no longer theoretical. It was intimate. It was immediate. It was two women who had given up everything for a dream, only to find it was constructed on quicksand. Kody's attorney rose to cross-examine, trying desperately to salvage what was left of his client's image. Mrs. Brown, he began with a forced smile. Isn't it true that Mr. Brown was the legal head of the family's financial trust? Meri's eyes locked on him with icy precision. Legal head? Maybe. But morally? Ethically? No. He was supposed to be a partner, not a dictator. And isn't it true too, the lawyer continued, that you profited from some of Mr. Brown's investments? Profited? Meri's anger finally overcame her, and she yelled. If by profited you mean I had to stand and watch him purchase Robyn a $900,000 home while I was begging lenders not to repossess mine, then yes, I profited. Laughter and gasps blended together from the crowd, but the judge rapidly struck her gavel. Order, she ordered. The tension was alive now, a living thing that pulsed in the courtroom. The prosecution's next witness was a former financial planner who had worked briefly for the Brown family. Her testimony was devastating. I cautioned Mr. Brown about the potential legal danger of taking funds without reporting, she testified. He said to me, and I'm quoting, "They don't need to know everything. I'm guarding the family." The comment struck like a thunderclap. Janelle's jaw set. Meri shook her head in shock. That phrase, protecting the family, was Kody's creed for years. Now it was apparent it had been a front for deception. The lawyer turned back to Janelle. How did this fraud affect your life, Mrs. Brown? The question flung open the floodgates. It broke everything. She spoke softly. My trust, my faith, my sense of family. I gave decades of my life to creating something with him. I had believed in plural marriage. I had believed we were partners. But now I see we were merely resources for him. Labor, funds, image. And when we were no longer useful, he threw us away. Meri nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. We gave up dreams, chances, and friendships because we were convinced that what we were creating. And meanwhile, he was creating something else altogether. Something that did not involve us. The lawyer waited for emphasis, then asked the question that all the people in the courtroom, and all the viewers of the televised trial had been anticipating. Mrs. Brown, he inquired, did you ever think that Mr. Brown was going to give you any of that money? No, she said firmly. Not for an instant. Silence. Crushing, heavy silence. It was the weight of truth settling into the room, unshakable and irrevocable. Kody finally lifted his head, his own face white and strained. For once, the man who had always thought he could sweet-talk his way out of anything was at a loss for words. The story he'd so meticulously constructed over the years, of a loving husband, a committed father, a misunderstood polygamist, was crumbling. All that was left was the picture of a man who had betrayed the very people who had constructed his life with him. Outside the courthouse, demonstrators assembled, some bearing signs with justice for Janelle and Meri, others greed destroys families. The case had transcended the courtroom now. It had become emblematic of something greater: the breach of trust, abuse of power, extremes to which individuals will go to conceal their transgressions. As the session was drawing to a close, the judge leaned forward, her face somber. "This court takes seriously charges of impropriety in financial dealings," she stated, "particularly when they entail dishonesty within a familial or marital context. Mr. Brown, I want to caution you very strongly to take seriously what has been laid before you today." Kody did not answer. He could not. The depth of what he had done, the deceptions, the manipulation, the greed, was bearing down upon him, fragment by fragment. And for the first time, he appeared to realize that there was no easy exit. As the gavel fell, marking the close of the day's business, Janelle and Meri stood side by side. They didn't say a word, but they didn't have to. Their expressions were telling this wasn't revenge. It wasn't even about money anymore. It was about taking back their dignity, their voice, and their power. For so long Kody had made them believe they were helpless without him, that their lives, their future, their value depended on his guidance. But here, before the unforgiving glare of fluorescent courtroom lights, that delusion was crumbling. They weren't helpless. They were plaintiffs. They were tellers of the truth. They were women seeking justice. And the world was watching. As they stood outside with the reporters and blinding cameras, one thing became utterly clear. The breaking point wasn't that moment when they found out Kody betrayed them. It was this moment. The moment they said no more victim. The moment they decided to fight back. And in accomplishing that, they'd already won. The third day of the trial dawned with tension, so palpable it felt like you could cut with a knife. Every courtroom chair was taken, every pen of every reporter poised, every camera trained on one woman, Robyn Brown, the wife once portrayed as the favorite wife. The one whom many felt had Kody's heart and devotion above anyone else, was now standing in the witness box as a central player in the scandal that tore their family in two. But no one could have anticipated how rapidly her testimony would unravel, and how deeply her own deceptions would bring her crashing down. Robyn slowly made her way to the stand, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Her face was smeared with precisely crafted innocence. Light makeup, quivering lips, wide and tearful eyes, as if she was the actual victim here. It was the same expression she had perfected over the years, the same one that tended to dissolve Kody's guards and stifle any form of criticism from the other wives. But this time, it wasn't only Kody she had to persuade. This time, a dozen strangers on a jury and millions viewing worldwide were ready to pass judgment on her. "Mrs. Brown," the prosecutor started calmly, "you've been called the family's financial manager. Would you agree with that?" Robyn fidgeted in her chair. "I assisted with some paperwork. I was involved. Yes, but only to simplify things for everybody. Kody and I were attempting to make intelligent decisions for the family's future." The lawyer nodded, shuffling through a pile of papers. "Intelligent decisions, such as forming 3 independent companies solely in your name." The question struck her like a blow. "Those were investments," Robyn stuttered. "They were intended to finance the family business." The prosecutor approached the evidence screen and touched a page. "Mrs. Brown, these investments reveal more than $120,000 flowed from the family's joint account into an LLC with only you on it as a registered owner. Can you tell me how that benefits the family if the other wives were unaware?" Robyn's hands trembled slightly as she fidgeted with a tissue. "We intended to tell them," she said, her voice cracking. But Kody was worried. He didn't want to cause unnecessary conflict. From the plaintiff's table, Meri let out a bitter laugh. The judge quickly silenced the room, but the damage was done. The jury had seen that reaction, a raw, unfiltered response that screamed, "We've heard these excuses before." The lawyer pushed further. "Mrs. Brown, did it happen to be the case that while Janelle was selling off her retirement fund to pay for property taxes, you bought an expensive SUV for cash?" The room burst into murmurs. Robyn's face turned beet red. It was for the family, she whispered. We needed dependable transportation for the children. For $78,000. The lawyer riposted. That's an awfully pricey school commute, don't you think? Robyn did not reply. The silence was louder than any of the excuses she could muster. And in that silence, the picture of the innocent, misunderstood wife began to break down. But the prosecution were far from finished. They had one more witness to call, a forensic accountant, a reserved woman with glasses and a calm air of authority. Her evidence would alter everything. Our search followed some $238,000 from the family's common account into 3 organizations, all of which have Robyn Brown as sole beneficiary, she explained. These were spent on a range of personal expenses, ranging from luxury items, private school fees, real estate investments, and business ventures outside the family trust. The courtroom gasped once more. Janelle's fists were clenched tightly in her lap. Meri shut her eyes, struggling not to cry. They'd suspected mismanagement, sure. But to hear the extent of it, hundreds of thousands of dollars redirected without their knowledge, was to feel betrayed all over again. Mrs. Brown, snapped the prosecutor. Did you ever reveal these accounts or purchases to the plaintiffs? No, Robyn confessed quietly. But I promise it wasn't intended to hurt anyone. Kody told. The attorney broke in. But you signed on the dotted line. You authorized the transfers. You managed the accounts. Isn't that right? Robyn paused, then nodded. Yes. The courtroom was quiet. It was a mere admission, but it had the force of a confession. Robyn wasn't merely a passive agent. She was an active participant in the con. The good wife myth died, replaced by a vision of a woman who had deliberately drained money from those who trusted her most. Meri's lawyer stood for cross-examination, her voice icy and measured. Mrs. Brown, do you remember a discussion in which Meri requested assistance with financing repairs to her inn?
Yes, Robyn said softly. And you informed her there wasn't enough funds.
Yes.
Was money available within those concealed accounts at the time?
Robyn's lips opened. But she said nothing. The silence lingered, and the response was evident before she uttered it. Yes, she breathed at last. And do you remember Janelle inquiring whether the family could contribute funds to pay for property taxes on Coyote Pass?
Yes.
And once more you replied, there wasn't enough money.
Yes.
Was there money available at the time? Robyn's response was almost inaudible.
Yes.
The courtroom exploded with whispers and gasps. The betrayal was no longer just numbers on a spreadsheet. It was real, tangible cruelty. While Meri's business suffered, and Janelle risked her financial future, Robyn had money tucked away for luxuries and investments. It wasn't just greed, it was manipulation. The prosecution then introduced one last bit of evidence, an audio tape of a phone conversation between Robyn and an ex-financial advisor. The room grew quiet as Robyn's voice came through the speakers. They don't need to know everything. It'll only cause drama. If we just wait it out, they'll never figure it out. Meri hid her face in her hands. Janelle looked straight ahead. Unreadable, but her jaw clenched with anger. The faces of the jury hardened. Sympathy they may have had for Robyn disappeared with that one recording. Mrs.
Brown?
Asked the prosecutor one last question. Were you ever going to tell them? Robyn stalled for a long time, her well-prepared mask of deceit finally shattering.
No,
she confessed. I didn't think they'd get it. You're right about that, Meri snarled under her breath. We'll never know how you managed this. The judge demanded order then again. But it was too late. The tide had turned. Robyn's testimony, intended to justify what she had done, had had the opposite effect. It revealed the cold calculation in the deception. It showed that this was not an accident or a misinterpretation. It was a calculated scheme. As Robyn left the stand, she cast a look in the direction of Kody, hoping for reassurance. But for the first time, Kody would not meet her gaze. He looked straight ahead, his face empty. Their bond, once impenetrable, was now beginning to crack under the weight of reality. Outside the courthouse, the headlines were vicious. Robyn Brown exposed. Lies, luxury, and the secret accounts. Favorite wife no more. Robyn's betrayal stuns courtroom. Brown empire built on deceit. For Janelle and Meri, however, This was not about headlines. It was about justice. It was about proving to the world, and to themselves, that the manipulation was finished, that the days of being silenced, dismissed, and controlled were behind them. And yet, as they departed the courtroom that day, they knew the battle wasn't finished. Robyn's testimony had shattered the fantasy. Sure, but the ultimate showdown was yet to come. Because next, the man behind it all, the man who betrayed them more than anyone, would be forced to stand before the stand himself. And Kody Brown, the patriarch who had thought he could outsmart, outshout, and outrun everybody else, was on the verge of encountering the one thing he could never manipulate: the truth. The fourth trial day was the most highly promoted of them all. All seats were occupied hours in advance of the proceedings, and the courthouse steps outside were a frenzied tempest of flashbulb light and live television feed. The rumors were constant. Kody takes the stand today. Following days of incriminating testimony, piles of bank statements, and Robyn's faltering defense, the man at the middle of it all was going to have to confront the questions no spin or charisma could protect him from. For more than a decade, Kody Brown had lived according to his own design. His wives obeyed his dictates. His story filled the show, and his version of reality was all anyone needed to care about. But now, bereft of his authority and exposed under oath, he was nothing more than another defendant, with nowhere to hide. The doors of the courtroom swung open, and Kody stepped in with a rigid posture that belied the hurricane brewing within him. His cocky stride was now more measured, his habitual smirk missing. He was dressed in a black suit, and a face that attempted, and failed, to convey mastery. Janelle and Meri ignored him as he strode past them. The man who had once been their spiritual guide, the pillar of their family, was now just a stranger they were suing. And that was a truth so heavy no verdict could ever come close. "Mr. Brown," the prosecutor started, walking slowly as Kody swore on the witness stand and sat down. "You understand that you are under oath, and must respond with truth?" "Yes," Kody replied, his tone softer than normal. "Good. Then let's begin with an easy question. Did you sign off on the transfer of more than $236,000 from the shared family account into businesses owned by just you and Mrs. Robyn Brown?" Kody paused uncomfortably, fidgeting. I might have signed off on some transfers, yes." "Some?" the prosecutor repeated. "We have records that indicate all of them are signed by you. Are you saying that isn't so?" Kody swallowed hard. "No, I'm not admitting it." The prosecutor nodded again, his voice even and unyielding. "Why then, did you do it without consulting Mrs. Janelle Brown, or Mrs. Meri Brown, who were joint owners of that account?" Kody's jaw clenched. "I made those choices in the best interest of the family. There were investments, opportunities that benefited who?" The prosecutor cut in. "Because we've had testimony that while you were moving hundreds of thousands of dollars, Mrs. Janelle was selling her retirement, and Mrs. Meri came close to losing her business. Were those decisions in their best interest?" Kody ducked his head, his silence more damning than any response. "Let me rephrase the question," the prosecutor went on. "Were these investments brought up with the family?" "No," Kody acknowledged. "Not all of them." "Were any of them discussed?" "No." The jury shifted uncomfortably. It was a devastating admission, one that tore down the illusion Kody had constructed for years. For a man who lectured about togetherness, communication, and mutual responsibility, it was now inescapable that his choices were being made behind the scenes. Meri's attorney stood up next, her questions incisive. "Mr. Brown, you informed my client that there was no funds available for her renovations of the inn. Do you remember that?" "Yes." "Were there tens of thousands of dollars in accounts that you managed at the time?" "Yes." "And you informed Mrs. Janelle Brown that the family was not able to pay property taxes on Coyote Pass?" "Yes." "And yet you and Mrs. Robyn Brown bought a $78,000 car during the same time frame. Is that true?" Kody leaned back in his chair, speaking in a whisper. "Yes." "Why, Mr. Brown?" And there it was, the question he had dreaded. Why? Why betray the women who had constructed his world, who had stood with him for years, who had given him everything? Kody breathed deeply, his mask of control slipping. "Because I felt like I needed to make decisions for the family good." They don't always get the big picture. I was protecting them. The lawyer's voice turned cold. Protecting them, or protecting yourself? The room fell silent. Kody's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His silence spoke louder than any excuse could. The prosecutor wasn't finished. Mr. Brown, do you know that concealing marital assets from your wives is financial fraud under state law? Yes. Then why did you keep doing it? Kody's face flushed crimson. Because I thought I could repair it before they ever even realized. He spat out. I didn't think they'd take it this far. The words hovered in the air. Selfish, desperate, revealing. He hadn't been attempting to shield anyone. He had been attempting to keep himself from being held accountable. And now, the truth was finally exposed. Cross-examination turned to his relationship with Robyn, and the courtroom sensed the tension heighten. Mr. Brown, the prosecutor charged. Isn't it a fact that most of these funds were used for expenses entirely on behalf of Mrs. Robyn Brown and her children? Kody gulped hard. Some of it was. Yes. Some, or most. Most. While the other wives were not doing so well economically. Yes. And did you think that was equitable? I felt it was necessary. Janelle, quietly seated at the plaintiff's table, finally spoke up, not to the lawyers or the judge, but to him. You broke every promise you ever made, she said firmly, but with years of anger trembling beneath her words. You told us we were equals. You told us you valued us. And then you treated us like we were disposable. Kody's eyes flashed toward her for a brief moment. It was the first time in days that he had ever looked at her. But he could not sustain the look. Shame made his eyes return to the floor. The prosecutor continued. Mr. Brown, you stated in prior interviews that you are a man of faith and integrity. Do you think those values are reflected in the decisions you made? Kody's answer was so soft it was almost inaudible. No. And do you regret those decisions? Yes. The confession had perhaps been effective at one time, but now it sounded empty. Too little, too late. The harm was already done. The jury had heard all they needed to hear. The portrait of the misunderstood patriarch was gone, replaced by that of manipulator. A man who broke his trust in those who trusted him most for ego and control. Then there was the knockout punch. Unexpected evidence the prosecution had held in reserve until this moment. Mr. Brown, the lawyer said, holding a printed email aloft. Did you send your accountant this message on June 3, 2021? Kody furrowed his brow. I don't know. Let me read it out. If Meri or Janelle inquire about the accounts, inform them that everything is invested. Don't mention the Flagstaff property or Robyn's LLC. The less they know, the better. Is that your email? Kody's face turned white. Yes, he whispered. The courtroom exploded. Gasps, whispers, even a couple of shouts from the back. The judge pounded her gavel again and again for quiet. Order. I will have order, she shouted. But the weight was too much to bear. It was the smoking gun. Evidence that this wasn't mismanagement or confusion. It was deliberate deceit. When the courtroom finally fell silent, the prosecutor uttered the final query of the day. Mr. Brown, do you get it now that you're here? Do you get what you did? For the first time throughout the trial, Kody seemed completely shattered. The bravado had disappeared. The excuses had disappeared. All that was left was a man bereft of every delusion he had constructed about himself. Yes, he whispered. I betrayed them. The hearing concluded with the judge's words ringing in everyone's ears. This court will not uphold willful concealment of assets. The evidence brought before us speaks volumes. Mr. Brown, you are not greater than the law, and you will account for these actions. As Kody left the stand, the burden of the truth bore down upon him. He refused to meet anyone's gaze, even Robyn's. On the outside, reporters called out his name, but he said nothing. For the first time in decades, Kody Brown was mute. The man who had always had an answer, always been in charge, always molded the narrative to his own advantage, had finally lost control of the story. Janelle and Meri stood there and let him walk away, their faces twisted in anger and relief. They had waited for so many years for this day, not to embarrass him, not even for revenge, but to have the truth finally spoken aloud, where the entire world could hear it. And now, as he vanished behind the heavy doors of the courtroom, they knew the trial had already done something even more powerful than rendering a verdict. It had taken away from Kody the illusion of power that he had always believed in. Undefined for the first time in his life, Kody Brown was truly held accountable, and the reckoning had barely started. The fifth day of the trial dawned under drizzly skies, as if even nature comprehended the gravity of what was about to unfold. In the courtroom, there was an unusual quietness, not the nervous tension of the early days, but a more profound, quieter gravity. They all knew the most damning of the evidence had already been revealed: the bank statements, the emails, the witness testimony. But today was not about figures or lawyer lingo. Today was about something so much more potent: the human toll. This session would expose the emotional destruction Kody's infidelity had left in its wake. And for Janelle and Meri, it was the day they would finally be able to tell the world what it felt like to have their lives ripped apart by someone they once trusted above all else. Janelle went first. As she walked up to the witness stand, the eyes of the gallery trailed after her every step. But not this time. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't irate or combative. She was composed, the sort of composed that only comes when the worst has already occurred and there's nothing left to lose. The bailiff administered the oath to her, and she drew a deep breath before she began to speak. "I want to begin by saying that this is not about money any longer," she stated firmly, her voice unwavering. "This is about betrayal. This is about lying, manipulation, and utilization by somebody I believed in." The prosecutor nodded. "So Mrs. Brown, how did what Mr. Brown did personally impact you?" Janelle glanced over at Kody for the first time in days. He attempted to look her in the eyes, but immediately averted his gaze. "I gave him 30 years of my life," she continued, every word falling like a sledgehammer. 30 years of establishing a family, raising kids, giving up dreams, because I believed in what we were creating together. And for all that, I wasn't a partner. I wasn't a wife. I was a resource. I was a bank account he could use whenever he pleased." The room was still. Janelle's voice did not crack, but the ache beneath it was unmistakable. "When he told us we were running in the red, I believed him. I got rid of my car. I worked overtime. I even withdrew some of my retirement to save our home. And all along he lied. Do you know what that does to a person? To know that the man you trusted most has lied to you every day." Her words cut deeper than any bank statement ever could. This was not merely fraud. It was emotional abuse. It was betrayal on its most intimate level. "I thought I was creating a legacy with him," she went on. "But the truth is, I was creating his safety net. And when I was no longer of interest, he cast me aside like I didn't exist." Meri testified next. If Janelle's testimony was fire, measured but searing, Meri's was ice, cold, calculating, crushing. "When I married Kody, I believed in a common dream," she said. "I believed that plural marriage was about love, support, and equality. And for years I stood up for him. Even when folks said he was controlling or selfish. I said to myself he was doing his best. I had convinced myself he loved us all the same." She hesitated, her jaw clenching. "But now I realize that was never the case." The prosecutor placed a pile of photographs on the table before her. Photos of the inn she had dedicated her life to. "Can you describe what these photos are?" Meri's eyes softened. "That inn was my dream, my future. I had begged Kody to help me with the renovations, and he informed me that we couldn't afford it. I trusted him. I took out loans, I pleaded for investors. I worked nights to make it work. And the whole time he had money in hidden accounts. Money that could have relieved me of years of stress and debt." She stared at him now. "You let me struggle. You made me suffer. And you stood by and watched me do it. All while living comfortably with Robyn." A gasp ran through the courtroom. Even after everything, that piece of information, that he had watched them suffer and stash money away, was too heartless to fully grasp. The attorney questioned, "What was the worst part of all of this?" Meri sighed deeply. "The worst part wasn't the money. It wasn't even the betrayal. It was seeing that he never regarded me as his partner. He regarded me as a convenience. Someone to clean up the messes, raise the kids, keep the machine moving, while he made decisions without us. That's not a marriage. That's a business venture. And I was the unpaid employee." The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Even the jurors were shaken. This was no longer a case of secret accounts. It was a case of decades of manipulation. Of two women who had structured their lives around a man who treated them like tools. And if you thought that was the most astounding portion, it wasn't. Because the prosecution had one last card up their sleeve. One they had kept secret until now. Mrs. Brown, said the lawyer. Can you tell the court what you found out 2 months ago when this trial commenced? Meri's face set in a hard mask. We discovered that Kody and Robyn were going to move the money. They were going to put what was left in a trust in the names of Robyn's children. And then we would never have seen a penny of it. Gasps echoed the courtroom for the second time. Kody's head fell into his hands. He knew there was no spinning it. No excuse, no justification. He hadn't just robbed them. He'd attempted to erase them altogether from the future. The prosecutor resumed addressing the jury. This isn't an error. This isn't bad budgeting. This is a pattern. A calculated, intentional betrayal over years. And it reflects not only a lack of disclosure, but a total absence of humanity. As the day progressed, additional witnesses emerged. Past accountants, financial planners, even a real estate broker who had been requested to assist Robyn in buying property in someone else's name. Each of their testimonies drove another nail into the coffin of Kody's alibi. Piece by piece, the narrative he had constructed of himself, the loving father, the faithful husband, the man of God, fell apart. By the time court recessed for the day, the mood had shifted entirely. The initial days had been for discovery, for facts, for evidence. But now it was for something far deeper. The betrayal wasn't merely monetary. It was spiritual, emotional, moral. It had torn a family from the inside out, and the two women who would have done anything for Kody were now the ones calling him to account. As Janelle and Meri exited the courtroom side by side, reporters yelled questions. Cameras snapped, microphones were shoved into their faces. But they didn't cease. They didn't say anything. They didn't have to. Their silence explained everything. They were no longer the women who stood silently behind their husband on television, nodding and smiling as he made choices. They were the survivors of a system which he had constructed to keep them under his control, and now they were dismantling that system piece by piece. Alone inside, Kody sat at the defense table well after the judge had departed the bench. Robyn attempted to approach him, but he did not respond. He gazed at the vacant witness stand, the echoes of their voices still present in the air. I was an asset. I was a bank account. You saw me suffer. For years Kody Brown had thought his family centered on him, that they would never leave him, never forgive him, never obey. But this trial had established something he'd never thought possible, that they no longer needed him. The betrayal that he had believed he could conceal had instead liberated them. And as the sun went down behind the courthouse that night, one thing was certain. The man who once boasted he was the head of the family was now the reason for its ruination. And there was no turning back. Already, by the 6th day of the trial, something in the atmosphere had changed. The first days were filled with fury, humiliation, and explosive secrets. It now came something heftier. Inevitability. The evidential mountain against Kody and Robyn was no longer a mountain. It was an avalanche. And it would not be halted. The viewers knew it. The press knew it. And even Kody deep down knew it. The courtroom no longer viewed him as a husband who had made a couple of poor choices. They viewed him as a man who had staged a calculated deception on the very people who had constructed his life with him. But the day was not yet done. Because this was the moment when the trial would shift from merely an exposé of betrayal into something much more sinister. Responsibility. The prosecution started the day off by producing a witness no one was expecting. The Browns' previous accountant. She marched to the stand with a gentle professional air about her, the kind born from generations of keeping others' financial secrets. But today she wasn't there to shield anyone. Today she was there to speak the truth. I was brought in by Mr. Brown to oversee the family's combined income from multiple sources. The TV show, appearances, business deals. She explained unequivocally. Initially, everything was above board. All money was put into one account used to cover family costs. She hesitated, then directly addressed Kody. But then in 2019, that all changed. Mr. Brown asked me to set up more accounts. The accounts were in his and Mrs. Robyn Brown's names. Alone, he especially made it clear for me not to share them with Mrs. Janelle or Mrs. Meri Brown. The courtroom exploded. Even the judge's eyes hardened. The accountant went on, unfazed. When I voiced my concerns about disclosure, he informed me, and I quote, "They don't need to know everything. It will only complicate things." He made it absolutely explicit that these accounts had to be kept secret. The prosecutor leaned in. "Did he tell you what the money would be spent on?" "Yes," the accountant said. "He stated it was to provide for his future with Robyn and her children." A murmur ran through the courtroom. One sentence, "his future with Robyn," told the whole story. This was not about the family. It never was about shared aspirations or common security. It was about creating a new life, one that did not include the women who had given up everything for him. Janelle gazed directly ahead, her expression blank. Meri blinked furiously, holding back tears. Each had suspected, each had known. But to hear it said out loud by a professional, documented, irrefutable, was another thing altogether. It was the sort of truth that didn't simply hurt. It left scars. The prosecutor continued. "Were there ever conversations about notifying the plaintiffs of these stories?" "No," said the accountant firmly. "As a matter of fact, Mr. Brown made me sign a non-disclosure agreement so they would never know." The faces of the jury hardened. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others wrote furiously in their notebooks. The story was no longer one about secret money. It was one about intentional, calculated lying, supported by legal agreements and professional complicity. Then the prosecution produced a second witness, one of Kody's former business partners. "We were talking about a new property development venture in 2022, he testified. Kody said he was gearing up for a significant lifestyle shift. He explained he needed liquid funds because some of the wives were going to be cut off." The room fell silent once more. "Cut off?" the prosecutor pressed, her voice piercing. "Yes," said the man. "He told us the show was flagging, the relationships were failing, and he needed to stand up for what belonged to him. He also said, and I recall this verbatim, that once the dust had settled, it would be just him and Robyn." The effect was immediate. Meri's hand flew to her mouth. Janelle's shoulders shook as she exhaled sharply, the betrayal slicing deeper than ever. This wasn't just financial fraud anymore. This was abandonment disguised as strategy. Kody had been planning a life beyond them long before the truth came out. When Kody was asked back onto the stand to answer, his typical arrogance was absent. His shoulders slumped, his hands were clasped tightly, his voice devoid of its typical bluster. "I was trying to take care of myself," he mumbled at last, his voice little more than a whisper. "I knew the marriages were not working. I knew that the show could end. I didn't want to lose everything that I had done." The prosecutor seized. "All that you worked for. What about what they worked for? What about 30 years of their toil? Their sacrifices, their earnings? Were those not some of the things you worked for?" Kody's face turned red. "Of course they were. But I was afraid. I didn't know how to discuss it." "Afraid?" the prosecutor asked again, her voice slicing through the courtroom like a knife. "You weren't afraid when you were signing papers to conceal accounts. You weren't afraid when you were purchasing property in other people's names. You weren't afraid when you were lying to them and saying there was no money while you were wiring thousands to Robyn's LLC. Don't try to deceive this court with the label of fear. That wasn't fear. That was greed." Kody remained quiet. He had nothing left to defend himself with. But the strongest evidence of the day was not provided by a witness, but by Janelle herself. When she was asked if she wanted to say anything, she stood up slowly, her words shaking with feeling. "This wasn't ever about money," she said. "This was about trust, about love, about establishing a life together. And he did all that and made it into a business deal. He commodified us, his wives. The mothers of his children made us assets to be used. And when he determined we were no longer worth it, he wrote us out of the equation." Meri trailed behind her. "Years I stood up for him," she testified, her voice trembling. "I said to myself, he loved us, that he loved us. But love doesn't conceal money. Love doesn't construct a new life behind closed doors. Love doesn't dispose of people when they become in the way. What he did wasn't love. It was betrayal." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, some wiping away tears. Even jurors shifted restlessly. These weren't merely lawyerly arguments. These were human tales of suffering and destruction, and no excuses could erase that. The judge, who had been calm through the trial, finally addressed him. "Mr. Brown," she said coldly, "this evidence creates an image not only of fiscal malfeasance but of systemic dishonesty. It implies premeditation, a conscious attempt to hide, to deceive and to abandon. If you are found to be so beyond a reasonable doubt, you are not only guilty of fraud, you are guilty of betrayal at the deepest level." Her words resonated in the courtroom, absolute and heartbreaking. And in that instant, something inside Kody changed. It was as if the burden of what he had done, the deceptions, the avarice, the rational self-seeking, finally broke him. He leaned harder in his chair, his shoulders sagging, his eyes empty. Outside, the drama had blown up. Headlines blazed across all news outlets. Kody Brown plotted future without wives. Accountant affirms hidden financial betrayal. Brown empire in shambles. Protesters lined the courthouse steps with signs that said, "Justice for Janelle and Meri, and greed is not family." The man who had depicted himself as the misunderstood patriarch of a plural family was now a national icon of dishonesty. At the end of the day, Janelle and Meri emerged from the courthouse arm in arm. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. The testimony had done their talking for them. The witnesses had testified. Even Kody, with his silence, had testified. And the narrative that had been his, the narrative that he had owned and manipulated to feed his ego, was no longer his to tell. For the first time in decades, the balance of power had changed. The women he had discounted, manipulated and betrayed, were now the ones making him pay. And as they emerged into the crisp evening air, blinding flashes from cameras illuminating their way, they knew something essential had shifted. This was no longer a battle over money or possessions. This was a battle for justice. And they were prevailing. The tide had turned. Kody Brown, the man who previously thought that he could get away with anything, was now trapped, vulnerable and helpless. And as the trial rumbled towards its end, one thing was certain: there was no turning back. The deceit had been dragged out of the shadows. The truth had taken center stage, and nothing, not even Kody's well-spun story, could ever conceal it again. On the sixth day of the trial, the whole country was watching. News networks were running 24-hour coverage. Social media feeds were flooded with hashtags like #Justice for Janelle and #Kody Brown. Trial, and outside the courthouse, protesters held up signs that read "Truth over lies" and "Families deserve justice." But inside that wood-paneled courtroom, the atmosphere was strangely calm, the kind of calm that comes just before a storm. Everyone knew this day would be different. This wasn't about evidence or paperwork anymore. This was the day the truth itself would speak. And for Kody Brown, it was the day his empire built on control, manipulation, and betrayal would finally begin to crumble. The prosecution started the morning with a witness whose name had been kept under wraps for weeks, the family's former financial advisor. As she walked to the stand, Kody shifted nervously in his seat. He recognized what was about to happen. And for the first time since the trial started, there was genuine fear in his eyes. "Please introduce yourself and your association with the Browns," the attorney instructed. "My name is Linda Peterson," she stated defiantly. "I was Mr. Brown's financial advisor for more than 6 years. I managed their shared accounts, prepared their tax returns, and advised them on large financial matters." The room fell quiet as she went on. Initially, everything was open. All 4 wives were party to discussions, and decisions were made together. But about 2019, the attitude of Mr. Brown changed. He started asking for closed-door meetings, requesting that some financial issues be kept secret. When I asked him why the other wives were not being consulted, he informed me, and I quote, "They don't need to know everything. I'll handle it." The jury shifted restlessly. The lawyer walked back and forth slowly. "Mrs. Peterson, did you ever receive a directive from Mr. Brown to keep something from the plaintiffs?" She nodded. "Yes. He directed me to divert a portion of the family's income into a series of private accounts in his and Mrs. Robyn Brown's names." He was explicit about not telling Mrs. Janelle or Mrs. Meri about those accounts. Gasps spread through the courtroom. The lawyer displayed bank statements on the screen. Pages of transactions revealing money quietly shifted from joint accounts into shell corporations and private trusts. Can you verify these transfers? Yes. Peterson said. Each and every one was approved personally by Mr. Brown. The prosecution didn't stop there. Did Mr. Brown ever tell you why he was secreting away these funds? He told me he needed to secure the futures for him and Mrs. Robyn. Peterson replied. When I asked about the other wives, he said, they'll be fine. They always land on their feet. That statement struck like a sledgehammer. Janelle glared down at the table, her jaw muscles bulging. Meri gritted her teeth, battling tears. They had given up decades, starting businesses, raising kids, backing Kody's ambitions, and he had paid them back by telling them they were disposable. They weren't equals to him, they were pieces on a chessboard. The prosecution's next witness was a real estate agent who had done a clandestine property transaction with Kody and Robyn. Mr. Brown said he needed to do it fast. The agent testified. He said, the fewer people who know about this, the better. When I asked whether his wives would be signing, he said, no, this is just for me and Robyn. The lawyer cocked an eyebrow. And was the property bought with money from the joint account? Yes. The agent answered instantly. All of it. The courtroom lapsed into shocked quiet. The judge herself appeared shaken. What began as a case of secret money had transformed into something much darker, an intentional, calculated effort to wipe out Janelle and Meri from the financial future of the family they helped construct. And it was all on paper, all traceable, all inescapable. When it was Kody's turn to respond, he looked like a man cornered. His once proud posture was gone. His voice, usually commanding, was small and shaky. I did what I thought was best, he muttered. I knew the family was falling apart. I was just trying to protect what was left. The prosecutor pounced. Protect what was left. Or protect yourself. Because what the evidence proves isn't protection. It's a calculated attempt to enrich yourself and Mrs. Robyn at the expense of leaving your other wives out completely. It's deception. It's betrayal. Kody's jaw clenched. I was afraid, he said. I was losing everything. I freaked out. The lawyer's voice was icy. You didn't panic when you purchased property in shell companies. You didn't panic when you established clandestine accounts. You didn't panic when you deceived Mrs. Meri that you had no money for her in. Fear didn't motivate you, Mr. Brown. Greed did. The punch was hard. Kody didn't answer. He couldn't. For the first time, the man who always had an answer had none. But the most pivotal moment of the whole trial occurred when the prosecutor played a recording, one that had been acquired only weeks earlier. It was a voicemail that Kody had left for a business associate at the peak of the deception. His own voice left no doubt. I'm finished with Janelle and Meri, he stated bluntly. They're liabilities now. Robyn and I are forging ahead without them. Once the accounts are established, they won't see a dime. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, even tears. Meri covered her face, shaking her head. Janelle sat straight ahead, her eyes burning. It wasn't just betrayal now. It was contempt. They weren't wives. They weren't family. To him, they were liabilities to be disposed of. The judge struck her gavel again and again to bring order back into the room, but the damage was already done. The tape was the coup de grace. It demonstrated intent, premeditation, and malice. And in that instant, the trial moved away from what was originally a matter of fiscal controversy to something much, much deeper. A matter of moral accounting. The prosecutor's wrap-up for the day reverberated through the courtroom like a verdict prior to the verdict. This case is not about misunderstandings. It is not about mismanagement. It is about betrayal. Mr. Brown betrayed the trust of the people who constructed his life, who encouraged him, who believed in him. He did it knowingly, deliberately, and with one purpose, to leave them behind and take everything for himself and one wife. That is not family. That is fraud. As the court adjourned, Kody sat still, his eyes fixed on nothing. The arrogance, the confidence, the control, all of it was gone. The empire of deception that he had built was crumbling around him, and for the first time, he seemed to realize there was no way out of what was ahead. Outside, Janelle and Meri ignored the reporters who mobbed them. They didn't have to. The truth spoke louder than words ever could. And as they descended the courthouse steps side by side, there was power in their silence. The power of women who had been silenced for too long and were finally taking back control. The turning point had arrived. Kody Brown was no longer the man holding the reins of the story. The story had come to hold him in its grip. And as the sun dipped behind the courthouse, something was sure: the reckoning wasn't arriving. It had arrived. And there was nothing he could do to halt it. The last day of the trial came like the last page of a book no one thought would ever be written. Reporters flocked to the courthouse steps before dawn. Viewers of the show slept outside with signs, and live broadcasts filled up every primetime news channel. But within the courtroom there was no frenzy, just quiet, the kind of thick, crushing quiet that occurs when everyone knows that history is being made. This wasn't a verdict day. It was judgment day, not only for Kody Brown, but for every falsehood he had ever spoken, every deception he had ever created, and every bit of trust he had destroyed. Today, the gavel would come down, and things would never be the same again. Janelle and Meri sat together at the plaintiff's table, their hands held securely in a tight grasp. They had spent weeks reliving their agony, laying bare their shame, and battling for justice. They had witnessed Kody's meticulously created persona fall apart before the eyes of the world, witnessed Robyn's alibis melt away under proof, and watched the truth emerge from under decades of lies. Now, today, all that remained was the reckoning. Kody appeared in the courtroom a few minutes later, walking more slowly than he normally did, his head down. Gone was the confident patriarch, who had always drawn attention to himself wherever he went. In his stead was a blank man, burdened by the weight of what he had done. Even Robyn, who was normally stuck to his side, sat a few feet off, her hands shaking in her lap. They had begun this battle as a team, but they were not going to finish it that way. The judge entered and took her seat. "Court is now in session," she declared, her voice firm and deliberate. "We are here today to deliver the verdict in Brown v. Brown, a case involving charges of financial fraud, marital asset concealment, and misappropriation of funds." Every breath in the courtroom seemed to freeze. Even the cameras stopped clicking. The next few minutes would decide everything. Before the sentence was read, the judge allowed each side to make one final comment. Janelle went first, her voice firm but loaded with emotion. "This isn't about revenge," she said softly. "It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that no one, not even someone you loved, escapes betrayal like this. I gave 30 years of my life to this family. I trusted him with all my heart, but he abused that trust and turned it on me. On all of us. I want the court to hear that this is not about money. This is about dignity, and this is about finally having the truth acknowledged." Meri trailed behind, her voice shaking initially but growing firmer with every sentence. "For years I stood by him. I accepted his lies. I rationalized his actions because I loved him and because I wanted to believe that we were in this together. But we weren't ever in this together. He was always in it for himself. And I hope that whatever this verdict is, it sends a message, not just to him, but to anyone who feels they can lie, manipulate, and take without impunity, because there are repercussions. And today, I pray he will see them." Then it was Kody's turn. He got up slowly, his face ashen, his hands trembling. For what seemed like an eternity, he remained silent. The courtroom was so quiet that every gasp, every creak of a chair, sounded like thunder. "I've done wrong things," he said at last, almost in a whisper. "I hurt the people I cared about. I lied when I shouldn't have. I was selfish. And I wish I could take it back. I can't do anything to change what I did, but I want to be able to say I'm sorry. To Janelle, to Meri, to my kids. I thought I was doing what was best, but I realize now that I was wrong. I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air, but no one seemed moved. It was too little, too late. Words couldn't undo decades of betrayal. The judge nodded, then picked up a folder from the bench. The room went completely still. "Please rise," she said. "The jury has reached a verdict." Every person in the courtroom stood. Janelle held Meri's hand. Robyn stared down at the floor. Kody shut his eyes, as if preparing for impact. The four persons stood up and unfolded a sheet of paper, their tone firm and unshaken. On the charge of financial fraud, we find the defendant, Kody Brown, guilty. Gasps filled the courtroom. Janelle gripped Meri's hand harder. On the count of willful hiding of marital assets, we hold the defendant, Kody Brown, guilty. Kody's knees wobbled ever so slightly, and he leaned on the table for support. On the count of misappropriation of family funds, we hold the defendants, Kody Brown and Robyn Brown, guilty. It was over. All the charges, all the accusations, guilty. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambling to send breaking news reports, onlookers whispering angrily, cameras flashing like a storm. But amidst all of it, Janelle and Meri simply clung to each other and wept. Not tears of vengeance, not even triumph, but relief, the kind that comes only when the truth is finally revealed, when justice is finally served. The judge paused for the room to settle before reading out her verdict. Mr. and Mrs. Brown, she started, her voice hard and measured. This court holds that your behavior was intentional, premeditated, and profoundly hurtful. Not only did you both hide assets from your business partners, you hid them from them while you lied to them, deceived them, and harmed them emotionally and financially with great severity. This conduct is unacceptable in any law partnership, but especially in the case of a marriage relationship founded on alleged trust. She remained silent for a moment, allowing the impact of her words to be absorbed. Thus, it is the order of this court that all hidden funds and properties be confiscated and redistributed to the plaintiffs. Also, punitive damages of $310,000 are granted to Mrs. Janelle Brown and Mrs. Meri Brown. In addition, Mr. Kody Brown and Mrs. Robyn Brown shall be placed under a 5-year financial management program, in which all meaningful transactions shall be reported to the court. Robyn cried uncontrollably, burying her hands in her face. Kody just stood there, his eyes fixed on the ground. The man who had always had everything under his control, the finances, the story, the family, was now left with nothing. The kingdom he had built upon deception and control had crumbled, and what remained was a path of trust shattered. Outside the courthouse, the world had already responded. Headlines inundated social media. Kody Brown guilty. Justice for the sister wives. The Brown legacy shattered. Protesters were cheering. Janelle and Meri supporters wept with joy. To millions of viewers who had watched this family for more than a decade, it was the conclusion that they had always wanted, not because it was sensational, but because it was fair. Janelle and Meri walked together, shoulders squared, heads held high. They didn't give interviews. They didn't brag. They just walked. Two women who had been shut down, marginalized, and betrayed, now walking into the rest of their lives, liberated from the man who had thought he owned them. We were never powerless, Janelle breathed as they walked down the courthouse steps. We just forgot. Back in the courtroom, Kody sat far longer than the others. Robyn sat next to him, quietly crying, but he didn't take her hand. He didn't say anything. He didn't get up. All he could do was sit and look at the jury box and judge's bench, the location where his whole world had been torn apart bit by bit. For years he had felt invincible, but the reality had reached him, and it had devastated him. As the sun fell on the courthouse, one installment of the sister wives drama came to a close, but another was opening. Janelle and Meri were finally free to recreate their lives, this time for themselves. The kids would be taught the truth. The audience would be able to see the reality of the show. And Kody Brown, once the proud patriarch of a sprawling plural family, was now a cautionary tale about greed, betrayal, and the cost of believing you're above accountability. The gavel had fallen. The verdict was final, and for the first time in decades, justice, real, undeniable, irrevocable justice, had finally been served.